30 years after the end of the Argentinian Dirty War, the children of the disappeared were still searching. 30,000 people disappeared in the Dirty War. Among them were 500 pregnant women who gave birth in captivity, then were killed. Their babies are now 30 and struggling to discover who they are.
Well, I mean, there's many different kinds of documentaries, and Canada has a really rich documentary tradition of all sorts. I mean, like right at the beginning of my career, I worked at the Film Board, which was like the heart of, Canadian documentary. And the kind of documentaries I like the best are the documentaries that have kind of a human story at their center. I would much rather tackle a subject by the people kind of involved in the story than making big statements about the issues or stuff like that. So you asked me about the film that I did in Argentina last year. So that film happened by accident, and then I just got more and more and more involved as it went along. It started just, I was driving in my car one day and listening to CBC in the morning, and there was, and they covered one story interviewing a journalist who had been a prisoner during the war in Argentina. You know about the Civil War in Argentina about 30 years ago. There was a military junta, and about 30,000 people, mainly students and teachers and trade unionists and kind of lefties, were imprisoned and killed. And this woman had been a prisoner and survived in a concentration camp during the war. And she told a story that hadn't happened to her, but about many women who had had babies, who were pregnant and had had babies in the concentration camps, and then were murdered. And their babies were stolen by the military personnel who were imprisoning them and brought up by them. And the story was really fascinating, and she'd written a book about it, like with several other Argentine women. So I read the book, and it sounded like really interesting. This whole notion of a kid being brought up in a kind of right-wing military family and believing that was his parents, and then as a teenager or at some point as a young person, discovering that not only is that not his parents, but those people are the murderers of his real parents. So just having your entire identity exploded. And I thought, like, what would that be like? And Josette Gauthier, my wife and partner in making these documentaries, we took the idea to CBC, and they said no. It just was something that happened 30 years ago in Argentina. It just didn't seem relevant enough to them. And so we took the idea to Radio Canada, and they sort of were a little more receptive. But the reason why is really stupid. I mean, it had nothing to do with the idea. It was because the year before, we had tried to sell another idea to CBC and Radio Canada. It was about the Bre-X scandal. We got a little bit of money from CBC to go and find out. We were absolutely convinced that CBC would be thrilled, and they all said no. Like CBC said no, Radio Canada said no. And the reason they said no was because we couldn't prove that the Guzman was alive. So we said that's what the movie's going to be about, trying to find out whether he's alive or dead. And I said, whatever happens, it's going to be interesting because it's an interesting story. And they said, no, you're not moving the story forward. So they basically said no, even though they had put money into sending us over there to find out about it. It's pretty disappointing. So, and we thought our chances of getting any money on this Argentinian film were absolutely zero because it seemed like such an obscure subject to a Canadian broadcaster, even though it was interesting to me and to Josette. And Radio Canada said yes. And I think they said yes just because they felt guilty about having let us on in the Bre-X film. I don't know. That's just a guess. Maybe that is not the reason. Maybe they just liked the idea. But anyway, they said yes. So then we went back to CBC, and because Radio-Canada had said yes, they changed their mind and they said yes to it. And that's how the film happened. So the first thing that happened was we went down there and did a little bit of research. I mean, we had done some research from here, but we did better research there and put a little demo together because they'd only given us money to really find out more about the film at first, you know, the development money. And we showed them that, and then basically they said yes that time, you know, astonishingly, because it seemed like a more difficult sell to a Canadian broadcaster than the Briac story is a Canadian story. But they said yes, and then we started making the movie. And what happened to me was I decided really early on that I was not interested in telling the story of the war. I wasn't interested in the right or wrong of the situation. What I was really interested in was the experience of these kids and who they were now. So there's about 500 of these kids that were stolen. And of the 500, only 100 have been found. 400 still don't know that they're stolen. And the people who are doing most of the hunting are the grandmothers of these children. Because these women lost their daughters, were murdered, and their grandchildren were stolen. So they have spent the last 35 years searching for these kids, searching for their grandchildren. And they found some, and they haven't found most of them. So we found two twins who were stolen by a police guard in one of the concentration camps. And this guy was one of the worst criminals in the war. He was a rapist, he was a murderer, he was a torturer. Horrible guy. And they love him. It's their fault. He's the guy that brought them up with a lot of love. So that contradiction is what the whole film's about, is their story and how they're dealing with that. Because they're aware of, we talked to women that he had raped, who talked about their experience. We talked to all kinds of people. We tried to talk to him. He's in jail right now. We tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't talk to us. But we talked to his wife, their mother, they call him their adopted mother. The left wing in Argentina calls it the repressors, or basically the people that stole them. And, there's no question that she loves her children.
Nacieron nuestros hijos desde el primer momento que nosotros los tuvimos en nuestros brazos. Prometimos darle todo nuestro amor. Y ellos saben, aún hoy, que nosotros somos incondicionales.